Niall, what's in your notes today?
So Israel could strike Iran at any moment. The Biden administration had hoped to learn more about Benjamin Netanyahu's plans today. But a scheduled trip to Washington by Israeli Defense Minister Yoav Gallant was cancelled at the last minute at Netanyahu's behest. Just one more example of the Israeli Prime Minister's disdain for his sponsors in the White House and at the Pentagon. Netanyahu, like Gallant, stands accused of war crimes by the chief prosecutor of the International Criminal Court. And that's worth emphasising, even in a week when we mark the atrocious Hamas attacks of last year. America's selective focus on Israeli suffering has too often blinded us to the suffering of the Palestinians, and now to the Lebanese as well. 1 year on, atrocities ignored, brutalities excused, war crimes denied. But this catastrophe is not Israeli-made alone. It has been facilitated by a president of the Democratic Party, a president who talks of human rights while enabling terrible wrongs. The Secretary-General of Doctors Without Borders, Chris Lockyer, puts it this way, quote, "For 1 year, Israel's allies have continued to provide their military support to Israel as children are killed en masse, tanks fire on deconflicted shelters, and fighter jets bomb so-called humanitarian zones." Last week, almost 100 American physicians who have volunteered in Gaza over the past year wrote an open letter to Biden and Harris. They wrote, quote, "Every one of us who worked in an emergency, intensive care, or surgical setting treated preteen children who were shot in the head or chest on a regular or even daily basis." In a supporting document, the physicians noted, quote, "The rate of killing of children in Gaza since October 7th is 293 times higher than in Ukraine in 2022. Children don't get shot in the head every day by accident. And what have Biden or Harris done in response? He paused an arms shipment, just the one. And that's paltry when you consider that the United States has spent a record $17.9 billion at least on military aid to Israel over the past year. That's according to a new report from Brown University. Harris has sometimes sounded a bit more sympathetic to Palestinian suffering. But policy changes? There's not much sign of those. She has ruled out suspending arms shipments to Israel. And with Lebanon now aflame, she issued a statement a few days back noting that the US will provide assistance with, quote, essential needs, such as food, shelter, and water. But this is Biden redux from Harris, seeking credit for providing aid to suffering people with one hand, but accepting no responsibility for shoveling bombs to the military that is killing them with the other. Now, my point is not to suggest that Donald Trump would be any better for the Palestinians or Lebanese than Harris or Biden. He would almost certainly be worse. But one of the most ignominious features of the past year has been the willingness of liberal politicians and pundits to mute their criticism of a catastrophe, simply because the president enabling it is a Democrat and the nation in question is Israel. If a Republican president had embraced a hard-right foreign leader through a year-long slaughter, that president would rightly be excoriated. How about a Republican president that said, yes, but our support helps us influence our foreign ally to let in more humanitarian aid? CNN and MSNBC and the New York Times would remind us, rightly, that this effort had yielded such dismal results that the US had to build a floating pier off the Gaza coast. A pier, that is, that cost American taxpayers $320 million and promptly fell apart. How about if our hypothetical Republican president had said, yes, but our closeness to this foreign power, it's helped prevent a wider war. And even while those words were echoing, the foreign power in question attacked an Iranian consulate in Syria, assassinated an adversary in Tehran, bombed Beirut, and invaded Lebanon. Let's not kid ourselves or let the shadow of a possible second Trump presidency block out the reality that's right in front of our faces. What Biden and Harris and Tony Blinken and Jake Sullivan call a strategy on the Middle East has collapsed, and all that's left is a sludge of political and moral incoherence. Can Kamala Harris find a way out? Does she even want to try? If she doesn't, the verdict of history will be damning. But history's verdict can be a long time coming. Too late for the people who die for the mistakes of presidents, or of vice presidents, for that matter.
I think it's very important to point out what you just did, which is that the difference between Biden and Harris on the policy here is just vibes. It's just something people hoped for. It's not materializing. And you're right to say maybe she sounds a little bit more sympathetic, but that is just words. She has said that she would do nothing differently. I don't know that Trump would do anything differently. You say it would be worse. I don't know, because he doesn't speak very much about this policy. But no one, Democrat or Republican side, is going to give progressives what they want on this, is what it sounds like to me.
No, I think that's right. And I think progressives are not in as much of a minority on this issue as they are on some others, certainly within the Democratic Party. I think what you see is a disconnect between elected officials who are broadly, with the exception of the Squad, more pro-Israel, and within the Democratic voter base, a very different view where the plurality of Democratic voters in the overall conflict are more sympathetic to the Palestinians. To the point of Harris, I do think that it is important for progressives to put pressure on her, because so far they have been kind of satisfied with vibes, as you put it, with this sense of like, oh, well, she's maybe tonally a bit different. Tones don't save anybody in Gaza or Lebanon or anywhere else.
Right, and Biden got Genocide Joe chance, and she's not getting any of that, even though she's part of the existing administration. She's co-signed the policy, and she's not going to do anything differently. I mean, I can actually imagine her being even more pro-Israel than Biden is. In some ways, she has closer ties. Her husband is Jewish. She spoke at Israel's 71 of their anniversary parties, and so on. Now, she said she doesn't, like Netanyahu, but Biden privately, now that we know from Woodward's book, did you see those highlights yesterday? That in private, he's swearing and screaming about Netanyahu, but then, of course, is not changing anything about the policy.
Well, that's the thing. I mean, I did read those Woodward excerpts with interest, but one of the problems that I have is that we constantly get told just how annoyed Biden is with Netanyahu, but beyond pausing that one arms shipment, he never does anything about it. Would Harris do anything more? That seems unlikely. I do think Trump would be worse because, when he was president, he moved the embassy. There was like a peace plan that was very, very pro-Israel. His objection, though, seems to be that what has happened in Gaza is sort of bad PR for Israel, which is a very Trumpian way to look at it and not really the point. But yes, I do think that Harris has real questions to answer here.
And these policies are unusual from the U.S. standpoint, because past administrations, past U.S. presidents, Republican and Democrat, Reagan, George H.W. Bush, did come to points with Israeli leadership where they said, this is going too far and we're now worried for our security, and you've responded to an attack, and that was legitimate to do so, but you cannot unilaterally involve us in World War III. Biden uniquely has not taken that action where past presidents in both parties, who were strong supporters of Israel, did.
Yeah,
and that's what's so notable.
No, and I think that's a really important point, because look, the whole issue is, are American interests being served by what's going on right now? I would argue that firstly, there's a vast cost, but there's also an isolation of the United States on the world stage, because it's not, whether one defines oneself as pro-Israel or not, the absolutely staunch backing and the impunity that Biden has lended to Netanyahu, I think, is very dangerous for the United States.
We'll be back with more Rising right after this.